Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. We will be learning today Mirat Hashem Daf Kuf Chav Beis Amid Beis. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Yom Tov. We're in Siman Tuf Kuf Zayin, and we are holding right now in the middle of Sif Beis. So we're going to pick up on the second line of Kuf Chav Beis Amid Beis. And in the previous year, we had learned the halacha of branches or twigs that fell off of a tree, and they fell directly into the tanur, into the oven on Yom Tov. And we said the case was you had an oven that was outside that was not lit, and these branches or twigs fell directly from the tree into the oven. And of course, they're muktzah because they were part of the tree at Bein Hashmashos when Yom Tov began. So they remain muktzah for the entire Yom Tov. Nevertheless, the Mechaber said you're not allowed to light those branches the way they are. But what you can do is you could add branches, you could add other firewood into the oven so that you have a majority of firewood that is mutter on Yom Tov, non-muktzah firewood, and you could use that to be mavatal the muktzah firewood that fell into the oven, and then you could light the oven. Now we pick up on the second line of Kuf Chav Beis on the Beis, and the Mechaber says, Aval, however, im naflu batanor b'Shabbos. Let's say what happened is the wood, the branches fell off the tree into the tanor on Shabbos, and Yom Tov was Sunday. In that case, asar lahasikan b'Yom Tov shel achrav, you would not be allowed to light them on the Yom Tov that follows Shabbos, afilu al yedei bittul b'roiv, and it would not even be mutter to add non-muktzah firewood into the oven and use it to be mavatal, this muktzah firewood. Even if you did that, you still would not be allowed to light this wood. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah and see why that is the case. The Mishnah Berurah says in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Yud Beis, also lahasikan b'Yom Tov shel achrav, because now we have a different problem. Lefi shetlisha zu, this act of the wood, the branches falling off the tree, the removal of the branches from the tree, mechina oisam lahasaka, that prepares that wood for burning. While the branch was part of the tree, it was not royal lahasaka. The fact that it fell off the tree on Shabbos, that was an act that prepared these branches for burning. The kevan de b'Shabbos einam ru'uyim lahasaka. Now, since on Shabbos itself, you're not allowed to burn them because on Shabbos, there's no heter of any kind to make a fire. Im kain, it therefore turns out, ha-Shabbos mechina isam l'tzarech machar shehu Yom Tov. The act of the branch falling off the tree cannot be seen as an act of hachana for Shabbos, because on Shabbos, whether the branch is attached to the tree or it falls off and lands in the tanur, in both cases, it's not royal la'asaka, because on Shabbos, you're not allowed to make a fire. So the act of the branch falling off the tree and landing in the oven is not seen as an act of hachana for Shabbos. It's seen as an act of hachana for the Yom Tov that's coming after Shabbos. Ve'ein Shabbos mechen l'Yom Tov. And we know that Shabbos is not allowed to be mechen for Yom Tov. And that, like the Mishnah Berurah is going to mention, is an Issa Daraisa. That's something that we learn out from the pasuk by the Mun. V'haya b'yom hashishi v'heichinu es asher yaviu. It says by the Mun that on Erev Shabbos, that's when you prepared for Shabbos. So we learn out from there that Chayil, a weekday, could be mechen for Shabbos, but Yom Tov can't be mechen for Shabbos. Shabbos can't be mechen for Yom Tov. So this is a Daraisa that we learn out that Shabbos can't be mechen for Yom Tov. And therefore, as Katan Yud Gimel, that's why the Mechaber says, afilu al yedei bittul b'roiv. Even if you take non-muktzah firewood and you throw it into the oven and you try to create a situation where you have a majority of mutter firewood against this asar firewood that came off the tree on Shabbos, it's not going to help. You're still not allowed to light it. The Isser Hachana hu midaraisa, because over here the Isser is an Isser daraisa. Midaraisa ein mevatlin Isser. And yesterday, the previous year, we were speaking about an Isser darabanan. Over there, when branches fell off the tree on Yom Tov and landed in the oven on Yom Tov, so the Isser that we're dealing with is an Isser of muktzah. That's an Isser darabanan. So if you take non-muktzah firewood and you throw it into the oven and you have a majority of non-muktzah firewood against the muktzah firewood, you could use bittul, you could go ahead and be mevatel the Isser. But by Nissa Daraisa over here, where the tree branches fell off the tree on Shabbos, and it was Shabbos was mechin for Yom Tov, now you're dealing with a Daraisa Dika issue. On a Daraisa Dika issue, you can't go ahead and do bittel to be Mavatal the Yisr Daraisa. Now we go to Siv Gimel. Says the Mechaber. Very interesting halacha. Aser likach eitz mi bein ha'eitzim. When you have firewood and you're setting up your oven to bake on Yom Tov, we know that when you have a wood fire burning, very often you need a poker. You need a nice sturdy branch to stoke the fire. Says the Mechaber, Aser likach eitz mi bein ha'eitzim. You are not allowed to select a branch, a piece of wood from amongst the firewood, lachtois by ha'esh patanur, to use it as a poker. Why? The havale misakin moneh, because by selecting a branch and designating that branch as a poker, you have just created a keli. Very fascinating halacha. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah here. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Yodalit. Also likach, says the Mishnah Berurah, bein lach u bein yavesh. It doesn't matter if we're speaking about a moist piece of wood or a dry piece of wood. Av sheroyihu lahasaka. You might think that if it was a dry piece of wood, so how could you tell me that there's anything wrong with using it as a poker? It's not muktzah. It's eminently usable as firewood, so it's not a muktzah problem. But yet, it doesn't matter. Whether it's moist, whether it's dry, you're not allowed to do this. However, the Chavetz Chaim says, this is only a problem if you don't designate it on Erev Yom Tov. If you would have selected the poker on Erev Yom Tov and designated it as a poker, that would be fine. Why? Because the problem over here, Ois Katan Tezvav, is the Havale Misakein Mona. Because over here, the problem is you're creating a keli. Va'afilu einoi misaknoi klal. And this is true even though you're not doing anything to the branch that you're selecting to use as a poker. You're not shaving it down and making a point. You're not straightening it. You're not doing anything. You're simply selecting a branch from amongst the branches and saying, oh, this is a nice branch. I'm going to use this as my poker. That alone is misakin mana. Mikamakim hare oiseyu likli b'yom tov. By selecting it for use on Yom Tov, you're making it into a keli on Yom Tov. The same halacha would be true. Let's say you have a gate and you want to bolt it. You want to use a piece of wood to use as a bolt, to bolt the gate shut. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to select a piece of wood to use it as a bolt. Lahavriach hadeles, to lock and bolt up the door. Mitam zeh, for the same reason. Because by selecting it and designating it as a bolt, you're creating a keli. Until now, it was just a piece of firewood. Now, by designating it as the bolt for the door or designating it as a poker, you have made it into a keli. This is only doable if you selected it on Erev Yom Tov. On Erev Yom Tov, you're allowed to designate it as a keli. But on Yom Tov, you cannot. V'chein kol kahai gavna v'ayin b'simen tav kuf yud ches siv gimel. Now, over there, in tav kuf yud ches, we see a very interesting exception to this rule. In tav kuf yud ches, over here in siv gimel, it says, Lokach eit she'ena meyuchad l'shpud v'tzala by aser. If you want to use a piece of wood as a spit, it seems that you could do it, and that the selection to select it to use it as a spit, somehow that does not make it a keli. Somehow a spit doesn't reach the level of being a keli. Now the truth is, we saw something like this already earlier. Let me just see where it is. Yeah, so we saw in Siman Tav Kuf Aleph in Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Chav Ches. Chav Ches starts on Kuf Tes Vav Amud Aleph and continues on Kuf Tes Vav Amud Beis. On Kuf Tes Vav Amud Beis, the Mishnah Berurah said, Eitz shemechaten by ha'esh, the piece of wood that you use as a poker, Kevin shehu meyuchad lekach, since it is designated as a poker, harehu keli. It constitutes a keli. It's considered a keli. V'im nishbar b'yom tov asar lahasikai. And if the poker breaks on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to use it on firewood. Why? Because it's noilad. Before it was a keli, and now it's firewood. So this designation as a poker somehow is considered, that's a mamish an act of making a keli. Now, in researching this, from the Mishnah Berurah, it sounds like it's mamish an isser of misakin moneh. Now, misakin moneh is the isser, it's the malacha of makeh bepatish. From this Mishnah Berurah, it really sounds that just by designating it as a poker, you're mamish over on the malacha of makeh bepatish. That's mamish making a keli. Researching and looking at the Rishonim from the language of the Rush and from the language of the Bach, I'm not sure if they're saying that it's mamish makeh bepatish. The Rush's lashon is mechzi kemisake. It looks like you're making a keli. And the Bach also seems to say it's more of like a gzera. If we're going to allow you to designate a branch as a poker, you might come to be misakin moneh. You might come to actually make a keli. So again, from the Mishnah Berurah, it sounds like it's mamish misakin moneh. Just the designation of the branch as a poker is misakin moneh. From the Rush and from the Bach, it sounds more like merzi misakin, or it's exera that you might come to be misakin. Okay. Now we go to Siv Dalet. Says the Mechaber, Tanur shenafal l'soichai mitiach hatit. Let's say you have an oven. Now, their ovens, apparently, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah right away. Ois katan tezayin. Tanur shenafal. Mayri b'tanurim shebimei chachmei hashas. We're talking about the type of ovens that they had in the days of the Gemara. The chidemisayim l'kamei shahayu k'may kedera. These ovens were like a pot. They were deep and they opened on the top. And the way you baked bread was, does he say it here? Yeah. The way you made the bread was you took the dough and you slapped the dough on the side walls of the oven. That's how you baked these breads. And I think you could still see this. I think if you go to Coney Island Avenue in Flatbush and you take a look, you walk by Olympic Pita and you take a look at how they make the lafas. They have such an oven over there. It's right in the front because I think people enjoy walking by in the street and looking at how they bake the fresh lafas and it tempts them to come into the store. They take the dough and they stick their hand into the oven, slap it on the wall of the oven, and when it's ready, they take it off. Now, therefore, says the Mechaber, let's go back here to the Mechaber here, it's Siv Dalet. The way these ovens were made, the fire was in the bottom on the floor of the oven. The bread was stuck up on the side walls above the burning coals and the ash that were at the bottom of the oven. And the side walls were plastered with some kind of a tip, some kind of a lime or a plaster to make them nice and smooth. Sometimes some plaster would fall off the side of the oven. Now you could have a large shard of plaster that would fall off the side of the oven, fall to the bottom, but it would stick up into the height of the oven where it may interfere with the baking process. So says the Mechaber, Tanur shenafal l'soichai mitiach hatit. If you have one of these ovens where a shard of plaster fell off the side wall and fell down into the oven, im efsher le'efais v'litzlois by b'loi grifa, if it's possible for you to bake or roast in the oven without cleaning out the bottom of the oven and taking out that shard of plaster, and by leaving that piece there, the bread that you're baking or whatever it is that you're roasting will not become charred or singed from that shard of plaster that's sticking up, then also legarfai. Then you're not allowed to remove it from the oven. Why? Because this shard is considered muktzah, and if it's not interfering with the baking, then by you moving it, you're moving muktzah shaloi l'tzarech. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah here. I'm just going to read from the beginning of Eis Katan Dezayin. Ma'iri b'tanurim shebi mechach me'ashas v'chid b'sayim l'kamei shayu k'may kedera. These are like pots that were open on the top. V'hapasa yutoichin b'koslei hatanur. And the bread was slapped onto the side walls of the oven. V'im kain, and since that's the setup, hagecholim shebekarka hatanur, the burning coals that are at the bottom of the oven, ein yecholim lahafsid lapas. They don't denigrate the quality of the bread at all because the bread is baked up in the height of the oven. The burning coals are in the bottom. Rak tiach tit oilavena, but the plaster of lime or the of tile shenoifel that fall off, and now they might reach up into the height of the oven. And now it might actually reach up to the height of where the bread is being baked, the chayrech, and it might singe the bread. Then if it interferes with the baking, if it does not interfere with the baking, then the mechaber said you're not allowed to remove it. Why? Because you would be moving it shaloi l'tzarech. You would be moving it without any tzarech yontiv. And says the Mishnah Berurah, v'harehu muktzah. And this is a muktzah item. It's something that has no use. It's not something that has a yomtiv purpose. It doesn't contribute to the baking. It's not in there to be fuel. You don't even want it to be in there. It's something that fell off. It was a part of the wall of the oven. So this is muktzah. You're not allowed to move it shaloi l'tzarech. Now let's go back to the mechaber. 3 lines from the bottom in the middle. Aval, however, mutar lahashkiv ha'esh v'ha'efer shabai. What you are allowed to do is you're allowed to reach down to the bottom, to the floor of the oven, and smooth out the ash and the coals that are at the bottom of the oven. Kedei she'yeh chalak, so that the bottom of the oven should be nice and smooth. V'lo yiga b'pas klal, and you shouldn't have any mountains and valleys, peaks of ash or coal that are reaching up into the height of the oven where they might touch the bread. Afal pi, even though shem haya negea boy, if it would touch the bread, lo haya kedei lecharchay, it wouldn't singe it or burn it. It would just maybe make the bread a little bit dirty. If you have ash, if you have a peak of ash at the bottom of the oven, even if that ash is already burnt and it's not hot enough to actually char or singe the bread, still, you know what happens when you're cooking on a grill and there's ash on the grill, right? So it might not burn the hot dog, but you don't want to have ash on your hot dog. The same thing is over here by the bread. If you have a little mountain of ash at the bottom of the oven and it gets on your dough, you're going to have ash on your dough. It's not Tisha B'Av. You're not making this for the Sudam Afsekes. You don't want ash on your bread. So you're allowed to go ahead and smooth out the bottom of the oven, even though your bread is not going to get burned. Why is that? That's because, and we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah, over here we're dealing with something that's not muktzah. In the first halacha of the mechaber said that shard of plaster, you're not allowed to remove it, even you're not allowed to remove it if it's not going to burn your bread. You're not allowed to move it because it's muktzah. You're not allowed to move it shaloi l'tzarech. Over here, we're talking about a mountain of ash that you're allowed to smooth out, even if it's not going to burn your bread, because it's not muktzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Yud Ches, ha'esh v'ha'efer, the fire, the burning coals, and the ash, memnesha calls manchu cham, because as long as the ash and the coals are hot, ein alav shem muktzah, they're not considered muktzah. Ukedala'el b'siman tav tzadik chesiv tezvav, where we saw that ash that's hot enough to roast an egg, you're even allowed to use it for kisei adam, because it's not considered muktzah. It has a yom tov use. You could roast an egg for yom tov. And the Mishnah Berurah says it would seem, according to this, not only should you be allowed to smooth out the ash that's at the bottom of the oven, you could actually sweep out the oven. You could take out all the ash. So therefore asks the Mishnah Berurah, why was the mechaber careful to say that what you're allowed to do is you're allowed to smooth out the bottom of the oven? Why didn't he say you're even allowed to clean out the bottom of the oven? And from the smag, it also seems that you're allowed to smooth it out, but you're not allowed to remove it. Why not? You should even be allowed to remove the ash. The Afshir, he says, it's possible. Mishum Diyesh Eish Ba'efer, because amongst the ashes you have actual fires coming up. Ubegrifas ha'efer, and when you sweep it out, Yichbeh ha'eish, you'll extinguish that fire. Achein b'hashkava, but just by smoothing it out, Efshel Izar, you can be careful Shalayich b'ha'eish, that when there are burning spots, you won't touch over there. U'chahid le'el siman tavkov beis of aleph b'hagah. However, says the Chavetz Chaim, later on, the Chavetz Chaim says he found in the Pirush Mishnayis Rambam, and it's proven from there, the soiver that the Rambam holds, that even just ashes, even if they're not burning, you're not allowed to remove them from the oven. You're allowed to level it out, like the Mechaber says, but you're not allowed to sweep the ashes out. It could be the shitasai that the opinion of the Rambam is the gamzeh chashuv ketikun hatanur. This might be considered tikkun. It's like fixing the oven. Or maybe it's considered extraneous exertion on Yom Tov. Since you could bake without sweeping it out, just by leveling it, so then you don't have a heter to clean it out because that's a terchi yisera. Now the Mechaber said, over here, you're allowed to smooth out the bottom of the oven, even if the mountain of ash is not going to singe your bread. It's just going to get some ash on the bread. So I've cut your test, even though it's not going to burn your bread. If the mountain of ash would be hot enough to singe the bread, then even the first halacha of the Mechaber, the first halacha of the Mechaber was you can't take out the shard of plaster if it's not going to interfere with the baking, if it's not going to burn the bread. But we're going to see very soon that if that shard of plaster would burn the bread, then you're allowed to remove that too, even though it's muktzah. Why? Because now you're being metaltal muktzah l'tzarech. It's interfering with the baking. And muktzah l'tzarech eichel nefesh is mutter. You're allowed to handle the muktzah shard of plaster l'tzarech eichel nefesh if it's going to interfere in the baking. So certainly the mountain of ash on the floor of the oven, if it's hot enough to singe the bread, then yes, then of course you'd be allowed to take it out. The chiddush over here is that the mountain of ash you're allowed to level out even if it's not going to singe the bread. Why? Because it's not muktzah. Continues the Mechaber, the second line from the bottom near the end. Aval, however, if in the shard that fell into the oven, it's hot enough so that it will actually singe or char the bread, what you're roasting in the oven, if it would come to touch them, there's only a chash that it's going to come to touch them. But if it's hot enough that should it come into contact with the bread or whatever you're roasting in the oven, it would char it and ruin it, then then even though it's technically possible to bake in the oven without sweeping it out, because it's only going to singe what you're baking, but it's not going to burn it, it's not going to ruin it. So yes, it interferes with your baking, it interferes with your roasting, because you can get a singed spot on your bread or a singed spot on your roast, but it's not going to burn it. So really, you could bake, you could roast with the way it is. But, says the Mechaber, on Kuf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, Kemen Shahaya Mischarech, since it will get singed, Mutter Lagarfai, you're allowed to sweep out that shard of plaster, the Chashiv Tiltal L'Tzarech, because that constitutes Tiltal of Muktzah L'Tzarech. You're not mechuyev to have your bread or your roast singed. So you're allowed to go ahead and take out the shard that fell in. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cotton chaf, on the bottom line of Kuf Chav Beis Amud Beis, since it is possible for you to continue baking and continue roasting. Why? What the Mechaber wants to say over here is, Shaloi haya nisraf, with the bread that you're baking or the roast that you're roasting is not going to be burned. It's just going to be charred a little bit where the piece that fell in touched it. So it's not going to be ruined. So really you could continue to bake. You could continue to roast. Still, you're allowed to remove it. Why? On Kuf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, the chashiv tiltal l'tzarech, because now this removal of the shard of the tit that fell into the oven is considered tiltal of muktzah l'tzarech. Ukefishi yavur l'kaman say siman tav koftes b'haga the mutal l'taltal muktzah l'tzarech eichel nefesh. You're allowed to handle muktzah when there's a tzarech of eichel nefesh. The kasra paiskim, the paiskim, right? The kol zeh b'shenaf al atiach hayoim. This is only true if the plaster fell into the oven today on Yom Tov. Ayafilu esmail, or even if it fell in yesterday before Yom Tov, v'layadam, he said, you are unaware of it. Or it happened right before Yom Tov, so you had no time to take it out before Yom Tov. But if this happened on Erev Yom Tov, and really you could have removed this tit from the floor of the oven before Yom Tov, and you didn't do it, machma shikra, because you forgot, then also ligroif, then you're not allowed to do it. Kechol machshirin, like all machshirei eichel nefesh, she'ev shalasis b'yom yom, that are possible to have been accomplished before Yom Tov, she'also lasis b'yom Tov, that you're not allowed to do them on Yom Tov, v'ayin bir halacha, and we will stop over here. B'yitz Hashem, pick up tomorrow on the top of Kuf Chav Gimel Amid Aleph. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. The schus of Liman HaTorah should stand God's Klal Yisrael in good stead. The Rabban Hashem should be making on God's Klal Yisrael. Everyone should have a good Kibben Shtiar. Be well.